Just one more hour until reinforcements, aka me, arrive to save the day. But until then, keep your eyes on the highway and keep on trucking with Jimmy Mack on Road Gang Radio, y'all.
So I am making an effort here to look up something for Robert Braswell. The coldest winter it was ever spent was in Candlestick Park, by the way, and I'm trying to find out.
The coldest winter was the summer in Candlestick Park.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Willie McCovey. I'm not sure.
It's Willie McCovey. It's who it is. Yeah.
It?
By the way, it's Willie McCovey. Candlestick Park was infamous for being the coldest MLB park due to its notoriously strong chilly winds blowing off the bay, which inspired Willie McCovey to say, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in Candlestick Park." Well done. By the way, Robert Braswell is here. We can always find time to talk about baseball with the Braz. I can talk about baseball with anybody, but the Braz actually knows baseball. He knows a lot too. He knows that it's Tech Talk time with TMC. Thank you for coming in a day early. We really appreciate it. What you got cooking this week? What's going on?
Well, we were talking about baseball, but really we were talking about the weather. And one of the reasons that we were talking about all that, because it's been pretty darn cold in a lot of the country. And this is a great topic to start with on Tech Talk with TMC, because cold weather operation and air brake systems, they don't really go together well unless you're doing proper maintenance. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's so many good reasons to make sure your rig has clean, dry air in its pneumatic system, most especially so your air brakes work as they should when you need them. But there are misconceptions out there about what is the right thing to do when it comes to air system maintenance and inspection. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Air system maintenance, facts and falsehoods. And joining us on the show is Brian Screeton, who's manager of technical training and service for Bendix Commercial Vehicle Systems. Brian is an active member of the Technology and Maintenance Council and our S6 Chassis and Brake System Study Group, also our Technician and Educator Committee. He's chaired several brake-related skill stations in our TMC Super Tech National Skills Competition for many years, and we're very pleased he can join us on the program today. But before we get started, each week we always offer a special to our listeners. And this week it's our TMC Preventive Maintenance Inspection Manual for technicians. We're offering it today for the special price of just $25 plus shipping and handling. You can get yours by calling toll-free at 1-866-821-3468. Mention Radio Nemo, you get it for that special price. Also, if you're an owner-operator or a small fleet, you have 100 or fewer power units, you can join the Technology and Maintenance Council for the discounted annual dues of just $150. Do that, you're going to get our 2-volume Recommended Practices Manual and many other good benefits. So please do call that same toll-free number if you're interested in signing up. And as always, we remind our listeners that any TMC recommended practices we discuss reflect the consensus of our members. We offer them as recommendations only, and everyone must first determine for themselves if they are safe and appropriate for their operation. Please remember that we don't endorse any product, person, or service, and the opinions expressed in the show, those of the individual, and not necessarily the opinion of his or her company, nor TMC, unless stated otherwise. And with all that out of the way, hopefully he can hear us. Please welcome Brian Screeton. Good morning, Brian. Can you hear us, Brian?
No, I cannot. I can now. Yes.
There you go. Great to have you on the program. We were just doing a little introduction for you here. We were mentioning that today we're going to be talking about facts and falsehoods about air system maintenance. And you know what? With being cold winter weather, it's so imperative to make sure those air brake pneumatic systems are working up to snuff, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So let's talk about some of the parts of the air brake system first, right? You know, you have your air compressor, you've got your air dryer, you got the air lines, you got valves, you got crack pressures, you got ABS modulators. There's so many different pieces of the puzzle that you need to make sure that are operating properly, and clean, dry air is so important to all of that. But, you know, there's some misconceptions out there, and some folks say, you know, you should drain your air tanks every day. And some folks say, no, that's not the way to go. What's the right answer?
So the right answer is you should drain your tanks, but draining them every day, what that does is if you start off from a flat system every day, you know, that brings the opportunity for especially certain weather conditions, that you can saturate the desiccant in the dryer when you're building up from that. So you should drain your tanks. There's no doubt about that. But if you do it every day, you can have the opportunity to overcome the dryer and lessen its effectiveness on removing that water.
So what you're saying is that the air dryer could have a shorter service life if you're draining those tanks every day.
Yes. Yeah, and affects its functionality. The dryer can recover, but the desiccant in the dryers can only handle so much moisture. And if you're going from a flat system, that lengthens the time that it's going through the drying cycle, and at some point the cartridge will basically be at capacity, and then you're just bypassing it, and that moisture will just simply enter the system.
So if there's too much moisture, if the desiccant is getting overloaded in the system, is that going to make your air compressor work on too hard?
It it can, if that fosters other things, but really it just inhibits the drying capacity or the drying capability of the dryer itself. It can. There's a lot of factors. If it's a very humid day and you're doing this, that's going to be different than a very dry day. But in general, draining your tanks are a recommended practice, just not every day. Once it depends, and a lot depends on application. If you're an over-the-road tractor, once a week, once every couple of weeks would be good. But if you have a higher duty cycle like a garbage truck, maybe a couple times a week, something like that.
Some of the industry recommendations are, if your air dryer is functioning properly, that recommended drain interval will be even 1, 2, or 3 months, depending on what the duty cycle is. Is that about right?
Correct.
So
Application's a big thing with everything breaks, as far as maintenance and how things will last and things like that.
So just talk about duty cycle for a second. So if you're a typical over-the-road operation, you're not going over a lot of hills, you're down south, would that be a longer service interval or a shorter service interval?
Longer. If you're a line haul, it's so you got to think of it. In your application, how often are you hitting that brake pedal? If you're a line haul, you're on the interstate a lot. You're of course hitting the brakes, but that's very different than, like, let's say an inner city or a garbage truck that's hitting the brakes, many times, an hour versus, very limited when you're on the interstate with, a line haul and stuff like that.
Or maybe even if you're in one of the vocational, applications like construction, off-road, that kind of a thing, when you get that kind of aggregate, floating around, that might get into the system. So I guess you got to be, concerned about some of that too.
Correct.
So it's almost counterintuitive in a way. If you're draining your tanks every day, you're trying to make sure your air system is dry. In fact, it may not be as dry as you think because you're overloading the desiccant in your system, and therefore you're retaining more water in the system, and you're actually it's counterproductive. It seems counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Right. Yeah, and it really stems from, the days before air dryers, when the only way you're going to get that air out, the water out, is to drain the tanks. So,
is part of the issue maybe you're speccing the wrong air dryer if you're having problems? Is there some things that you can do up front before you even purchase the vehicle to make sure you've got the right air dryer and the right desiccant suited for the application that's intended?
Yeah, so there are different air dryers suited for different applications. Like let's say, there's different air dryers, we call them. They have more purge volume. So there's different versions of air dryers. So that basically the purge volume, the air that goes when you do purge, the dryer purges the air that goes out to clean the desiccant. There's just simply more of it, and that would be more suited to a high duty cycle. And there's also very specialized air dryers that actually have two dryers that work in tandem. One's drying, one's purging. So that's a very high duty cycle, like bulk unloading and things like that.
So it's probably a good idea if you're buying vehicles every so many years, instead of just buying the same air dryer spec you always did, think about your duty cycle for what you're doing today in terms of as opposed to what you were hauling, let's say 5-10 years ago, because whatever you were doing 10-15 years ago may not be suitable now. It's always good to work with your vendor to make sure you're using the right specification for your intended application. That seems to be the message when it comes to this.
Yeah, and even some vehicles in their second life, they do a completely different vocation or application, and it may be that you have to make some modifications, put a different air dryer on it for what the truck is being asked to do, now, if it's changed.
Yeah, that's a good point. You might be buying in the secondary market, and let's say you're in the vocational, but you bought an over-the-road truck for whatever reason. Yeah, that might not be the right air dryer for your intended application. That's a good point, and I'm sure your local dealer will help you with that when it comes time to put that thing into your first in-service after you've acquired that unit.
Yeah, and there's resources online like at Bendix.com. We have worksheets that help work that out as well.
And TMC's got recommended practices on air pneumatic systems too. We can help you out with that as well. TMC.trucking.org. You can always go there and get more information. Let's move on to another topic, and this is pretty controversial. We get this a lot at the Technology and Maintenance Council. When it comes to cold weather like this, and right here in the DC area, it's about 26 degrees this morning. Pretty cold. That means it's below freezing. The potential, if you have moisture in the pneumatic system, it could freeze. And if that happens, this is the age-old question. Should we use airline antifreeze or shouldn't we?
So airline antifreeze is kind of it's an after the problem's already there solution. I always say that proper maintenance per your application is the way to avoid even having the thought of putting air brake antifreeze in. Because air brake antifreeze is a contaminant. It will not remove the water, but it'll change the freezing point of that water in there, and it will free things up. But the downside is, antifreeze is basically alcohol, and that is not good for valves with O-rings and lubricants in them, and it does affect their performance down the road. It can.
So then the bottom line is you probably shouldn't be using alcohol-based antifreeze for your pneumatic system, and it's not even necessary if you're doing the proper maintenance. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, exactly. So if you ever get in a situation where you need to use that product, you really should take a look at your maintenance program, your maintenance cycle. Maybe it needs to be accelerated a bit.
So what's some of the risk that the alcohol poses to the internal components of the pneumatic system?
One of the big things is, when we, like in a relay valve, if we wash the lubricant off and we attack that rubber O-rings inside there, getting kind of into the details, crack pressure can go up, and that can also lead to uneven brake wear, cause timing issues, things like that. Things that you wouldn't think it can cause, but down the road, it can definitely hinder the performance of some valves that are pretty precise and need to work properly to properly stop that vehicle.
So let's just say that the weather conditions are expected to be below freezing. It's the end of my run. Are there some tips you can offer drivers as to what you can do so that you can prevent problems in the morning?
Yeah, you don't have to necessarily drain your tanks, but you may just pop the petcock open and see if you see any water in there. If you see, I'm not doing a full drain, but if you see a bunch of water come out, well, that's a red flag. Of course, you need to get rid of it, but you also need to report that to maintenance, or if you're maintaining your own vehicles, you need to rethink, okay, if I'm changing my cartridge annually based on my application, maybe I have seen fleets where they have to change them every 6 months just based on the amount of air they're running through the system. So that's a good barometer, just crack that petcock, see if you're seeing air come out or water come out. And if you are, especially a significant amount, you may need to rethink things.
What about fanning the air brake system down to just below the system cut-in pressure?
Well, that's a good point, Robert. So, if there's water in the system, you want the system to be in the loaded mode. And what you brought up, you fan the brakes down just below cut-in of the compressor. And that means that in the morning when you start up, if there is ice buildup, the compressor will be in the mode to start pumping and fill the air system. If you're in the unloaded mode and things are iced up, it won't build air at all. So that's a good point.
And that's a great tip, and that'll help you out in cold weather climates, so you won't have some of these issues that we've been talking about. You're listening to Tech Talk with TMC. We have Brian Screeton here with Bendix Commercial Vehicle Systems. We're talking about air system maintenance, facts and falsehoods. Brian, let's move on to contamination. It seems like contamination is one of the big issues that fleet maintenance folks wrestle with when it comes to the integrity of their pneumatic systems. Let's talk about some of the things that you have to worry about when it comes to contamination. What are some of the things you can be proactive about to minimize the chance of having that contamination in the first place?
So especially with tractors, and trailers, the big thing is to the couplings, the glad hands, to keep those connections closed when they're not connected to a tractor or trailer. There's various products out there that ensure that, but the biggest thing is to park those when they're not in use. Most all dollies and tractors have a place to put those glad hands to close them off to minimize contaminants from entering in there. I've seen, especially dollies, they'll be sitting along the interstate and you see the glad hands sitting on the top of them up, and it's raining and all that water is just getting right into that into that glad hand. So that's a big one right there.
Yeah, and of course, if you've got an air compressor and it has oil entering into the pneumatic system, you got to worry about that kind of stuff too, right?
Yes, yeah. When you do drain the tanks, we've talked a lot about water, but you also should be aware if you see a lot of oil or excessive amount. Now, keep in mind that all air compressors do pass some oil. That oil typically is taken out of the system with the air dryer, but it's not uncommon to see a little bit of oil. But anything excessive, you need to look at the the compressor may be running too much. Various reasons why that may happen. A big one is the discharge line is leaking, which sounds like it's easy enough to find, but if the discharge line is leaking, you're only going to hear it when the engine's running, and it's only going to be doing that when the engine's running. It's very hard to hear something like that. So any excess amount of oil that's seen in the tanks, you need to do a little bit of a troubleshooting to figure out maybe what's causing it.
The glad hand seals are so important too. Even if you do everything right, you keep them closed like you're supposed to. If the seals wear, and they do, you need to make sure you have a backup seal to replace it so that you don't have that contamination, entered into the system. I know a frequent guest on Tech Talk with TMC is Todd Coutier. You know who he is. He's been in the industry for many years, and he's got this tip he always offers. It says, if the seal looks like it's worn out, take it out, pop it out, flip it around. It's going to be just fine on the other side if you haven't already flipped it over one time, and that'll get you down the road for quite some time.
Yep. That's always if you're running a tractor, you should always have some of those spares as well. But if you don't, that's a good tip. You're right.
So here's another thing that people ought to know that are listening to the program when it comes to glad hand seals, right? So those front glad hand seals, they're supposed to be vented to atmosphere, aren't they?
Yeah, you don't want to. There should be especially when you park them, there should be a hole that allows the valve to breathe. You don't want to have a circumstance where you have false parking, air trapped in the pressure line of the trailer service line. So you don't want to have an unintentional release of the brake. So yes, we want that connection closed, but we need to have some way of venting any air to atmosphere so we don't inadvertently release the brakes when they shouldn't be.
Absolutely, great tip. We were talking about major sources of brake contamination, but some of these others that you don't think about as top of the list, I think would be like, for example, analog braking system modulators. There could be rust or contamination in those modulators, right? Because the air tanks could rust internally. What can you do about that?
Yeah, so there has been over the years, the steel tanks, they may look pristine on the outside, but they're rusting on the inside. And that's another thing to look for when you drain the tank. I remember in my days when I was a technician, drained a few tanks, and then they'll drain they'll drain like they should, and all of a sudden it gets almost like plugged up. And most of the time, what that is rust inside, trying to migrate out, and it starts to clog that drain cock. So when you drain your tanks, you look for rusty water or actual rust pieces coming out. And once that happens, you really got no more. The only other recourse is to replace that tank, because that migrates to downstream into the valves. And a lot of the valves, like a relay valve, there's a seat inside there, and if rust gets between that seat and the casting of the valve, that valve will leak, won't perform correctly. So when that rust migrates down into the air system, it can make modulators, like you mentioned, malfunction, and pretty much any valve that has a moving part downstream will suffer.
This is a little bit off topic, but I'm thinking about, say rusted tanks. I'm thinking about, like, if you grew up on a farm, you had to deal with farm gasoline tanks, or if you dealt with a motorcycle gasoline tank. Boy, it looked great on the outside, but inside they're all rusted. You got to go get your clean bag of gravel and put it in there and shake it around and take all that rust out of there and get some of that cream that they have for motorcycle tanks and coat the inside of that tank. Not really something that you do with an air tank, but it just reminds me of that. It sends home the message, though. It's not how it looks on the outside. It's on the inside that counts.
Correct.
What about the tractor protection valve? So important. And that's something, too, that can, have catastrophic failures if there's contaminants.
Yeah, so the tractor protection valve, its job is to protect the tractor if there was a failure downstream in the trailer. So, you got to think of the tractor protection valve. It's the actual switched component that closes that connection from the tractor to the trailer if there's a leak downstream. So if it's not functioning correctly and you were to happen to get in a situation where you do have that, massive air leak, the air lines going from the tractor to the trailer, or, something down in the trailer air system itself, it can't do that, and then you could lose the entire air system because of that. So, there is checks that you can do for the tractor protection valve, which should be part of a maintenance cycle just to make sure it's working properly. But it's so important for that emergency situation so the tractor does not lose all its air pressure. Yeah,
today's offer, the Preventive Maintenance Inspection Manual for Technicians, covers some of those items, and it's a really good resource to have. Let's talk a little bit now about proper and improper repairs, because you can get contamination because of that. It's not necessarily your operating environment. It's what you're doing as a technician in trying to make a repair, but you think you're doing the right thing and you're really not. And one of the things we hear a lot is that, well, hey, what about some of that Teflon tape? We can put that onto, the more the better, right?
No, not necessarily. I've seen a lot of valves over the years that they're not working properly, and guess what? It's got Teflon tape internally in the valve, and it's preventing the valve from operating and sealing correctly. Most of the time I recommend using the liquid, but even at that, a little dab will do you. You don't need to, put a gallon of it in there to seal it up. So an excessive amount of any kind of sealant is not a good idea, because it can migrate internally into the valve and cause problems.
So the bottom line is, maybe use a liquid sealant. Don't use the Teflon tape. And if you are going to use the liquid sealant, it's that Goldilocks principle. Not too much, not too little, just about right.
Correct.
If you are applying the sealant, is there a particular way you should do it? I mean, should you put it along all of the threads, part of the threads, in the middle of what's the guideline for that?
I always recommend, putting it on the leading edge of the fitting you're putting in there, and then when you install the fitting, it's going to migrate up as you put it in as well, to get the rest of the threads on there.
Yeah, I think I'm reminded of the days of working on cars back when they were carburetors. Boy, if you put a little Teflon tape on that fuel line going into the 4 barrel, boy, that sure can stop up your your jets real quick
Yeah,
if you're a
yeah,
little bit overzealous in how much of that white tape you put on there. I've been there, done that in my early days. So yeah,
hmm
good idea. Don't use too much. Don't use Teflon tape at all if you can help it. Use a liquid
correct.
sealant and try to just do it. Put just enough sealant to create that small ring around the threads, hopefully just at the end of the fitting, and that should take care of the issue. You'll be doing just fine with that. We're
Correct.
nearing the end of the segment here. Boy, it's flown by. Brian, any final recommendations for the listening audience about your air system maintenance, what you should do
The
as the
biggest,
winter progresses? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So the biggest thing I can say is, and what I see the most of is, changing that cartridge. The air dryer, that's its job, is to remove those contaminants, water and particulates. But to perform it well, it needs to have the air dryer maintained per the application. There's a lot of rules of thumb, but if you're seeing contamination in your tanks and you're doing basically what you think per the industry, your application may require a little bit more. So and always follow the guidelines of your OE. There might be minimum for warranty or coverage and things like that on changing that cartridge, but air dryer maintenance, that's one of the biggest things I see that's laxed in the industry myself.
We're just a couple months away from the Technology Maintenance Council's 2026 annual meeting. One of the topics we're going to be doing in our task force day at the S6 Chassis and Brake Systems Study Group is an update of TMC Recommended Practice 619B that deals with air system inspection procedure. Covers a lot of what we're talking about here. Brian, you're probably going to be working on that one, I think. That'll be working on that. Hopefully, we'll be balloting a new version of that probably later on this year. But that's a great resource for folks to use as a basis for a program to do your preventive maintenance on your air system. Any particular preventive maintenance tips you would like to highlight before we have to sign off on the segment?
Drain, like we talked about, drain your tanks, per your application, not every day, per your application. When you do your inspections, you look for things like too much oil around a valve, exhaust port, a valve leaking, when it obviously shouldn't be. That can be a sign of maintenance issues and things like that. So just good inspections. When you do your brake inspections, you visually and listening for things as well.
And we're listening for the sign-off being we're ready to go to the end of the segment. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us on Tech Talk with TMC. Look forward to seeing you in Nashville in a couple months and hopefully have you on the show again real soon. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Jimmy Mack in the studios in New Orleans.
Hey, Robert, well done as always. And by the way, it tied in so nicely to, with you coming in on a Tuesday to have you following Kevin Lindsay talking about turning the engine over, and you guys talking about how to kind of, do the maintenance on the as you get further on down the road to make sure that you can come to a complete stop. Well done. What you got on the docket for next week, my friend?
Next week, Roger May from Comment's going to join us to talk about wheel end maintenance on Tech Talk with TMC. Regular time Wednesday, 9 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Central.
Stay warm, my friend, and do well. Do good work.
You too. Thank you very much.